For over 6 unforgettable decades, Bill Anderson has been more than just a country music legend, he's been its beating heart. Nicknamed Whisperin' Bill for his smooth, intimate singing style, he penned timeless classics that still echo through honky-tonks and radio waves today. Few have stood beneath the shining lights of the Grand Ole Opry as long as he has, and even fewer have commanded the respect, admiration, and loyalty of both fans and fellow stars the way Bill Anderson has. His legacy isn't just written in songs, it's carved into the very soul of country music. For decades, Bill Anderson was the picture of grace in country music, always smiling through interviews, shaking hands, and signing autographs until his fingers ached. He welcomed countless newcomers to the Grand Ole Opry, making its hallowed stage feel like home. But now, at 87, the man whose career was built on kindness, composure, and quiet charm has dropped a bombshell no one saw coming, a secret list of 8 Grand Ole Opry performers he could never stand. This wasn't idle gossip or petty annoyance. It was a collection of grudges forged over years, born from betrayals, bruised egos, and moments of deep humiliation he never forgot. Behind the curtain of country music's most sacred stage, where the spotlight never reached, tension simmered. Backstage, smiles faded, voices lowered, and trust broke apart in the shadows. Friendships that looked unshakable from the audience were quietly eroded by arrogance, jealousy, and whispered rivalries. In the world of the Opry, reputations could be made in a single song, or destroyed in a single night, and Bill Anderson had a front-row seat to it all. Now, for the first time, he's revealing exactly who tested his patience, crossed the line, and earned a place on that unforgettable list. When Bill finally revealed names, it sent shockwaves through Nashville's close-knit music community. Fans who believed they understood the Opry's familial vibe suddenly found themselves questioning what truly transpired behind the scenes. As Bill Anderson began his revelation, the atmosphere turned hushed. No one could predict whether he would offer vague allusions or actually name names. Yet, Bill remained steadfast. He kicked off with 2 artists whose public personas were nearly invulnerable, legends in their own right, renowned for their chart-topping hits and magnetic stage presence. To the fans, they were icons. To Bill, they were persistent irritants. The first was a performer whose on-stage charisma concealed a devious nature off-stage. Bill reminisced about instances when this artist would discreetly alter the set list just moments before the show began, pushing lesser-known acts, including Bill himself, out of their slots. He recounted how this individual had, on multiple occasions, intercepted song ideas from emerging writers, claiming them as their own. Then came the second name, and the tension in the room escalated. Bill described this person as having an ego so large it could almost be considered a character of its own. They insisted on special lighting, refused to share a dressing room, and regarded fellow performers as mere background noise. Bill shared a memory from the late 1960s when that inflated ego collided directly with his patience. Following a trivial argument over who would close the show, the two found themselves in a verbal confrontation so intense that Opry stagehands had to step in to prevent it from spilling over onto the stage in front of the audience. Bill, ever the professional, suppressed his frustration in public, but privately, the memory seared deeply. That night, both of those names were indelibly marked on his mental blacklist. The Grand Ole Opry was a magical location for the fans and the audience. It was a place where country music seemed timeless, where tradition was respected, and where legends and up-and-coming artists shared the same stage. However, Bill Anderson was aware that the Saturday night shine of the Opry hid a messier, darker reality backstage. He discovered early in his profession that friendships might change with a single line on a lineup sheet and that smiles could be practiced as much as songs. Bill disclosed that one of the 8 persons on his list was hated for their brutal use of power rather than for a personal slight. They enjoyed the authority, and this artist was a gatekeeper. They had the power to influence producers, persuade management to change the order of entire productions, and even choose which new artists would be accepted into the Opry circle and which would be discreetly excluded. Bill was a direct witness to this. He was set to perform during a highly sought-after time slot, prime airtime, when the radio broadcast would reach millions of listeners in the early days of his Opry career. After weeks of rehearsal, he was told minutes before the show that his part had been trimmed to accommodate an Opry veteran who had unexpectedly requested an additional song. Bill never recalled the pain of leaving the stage without playing a single note, and the veteran's charisma in front of the audience concealed a habit of stealing opportunities. He related stories of other young actors whose hopes were dashed in a similar way, anxiously practicing backstage just to be informed that they were bumped at the last minute. Bill acknowledged that knowing the audience will never see this side of the Opry was the worst part. The veteran was a cherished celebrity to them. They served as a continual reminder to those who toiled behind the scenes that skill alone wasn't enough to succeed at the Oscars. It was about surviving in a society where friendships were rarely meaningful and politics dominated. That name, too, had merited its placement on Bill's list, not due to a single act of treachery, but rather to years of covertly sabotaging the careers of other artists in order to get attention for themselves. Bill Anderson has a reputation for remaining composed under duress. Nothing could have prepared him for the pain of being purposefully humiliated in front of an elderly Opry audience, even if he had endured lengthy tours, negative reviews, and the unpredictability of live television. It took place on a night that ought to have been one of his best. There was a lot of excitement in the air, and Bill had been scheduled to perform a moving ballad that he knew would make the crowd stand up. However, one of the most popular humorous figures in country music, a fellow Opry musician, was hiding backstage and seemed intent on bringing him down for reasons Bill is still unable to completely comprehend. Minutes before Bill left, the trouble began. This artist leaned over the control board and muttered something to the sound engineer while giggling. At first, Bill didn't give it much thought. Backstage, pranks were regular and usually harmless, but when he entered the spotlight and his song's opening notes started, something wasn't right. The band drowned out his scarcely audible voice as the music soared brilliantly. Confused, the audience shuffled in their seats, with some craning their necks in an attempt to improve their hearing. The more he pushed, the more clear it became, but Bill, ever the professional, persisted, straining to project. He had down the level on his microphone to almost nothing. By the end of the first line, Bill could feel the blush of embarrassment building in his cheeks as whispers sounded across the throng. He questioned the sound team after the set, and they sheepishly acknowledged the truth. It wasn't an error. Bill needed a little humility, therefore that so-called prankster had persuaded them to do it for a laugh. It was harmless fun to them. For Bill, it was a public betrayal of his dignity and his art. The audience had lost faith in him after he had spent years cultivating a reputation for professionalism in a single, trivial stunt. He merely shook his head sharply and acknowledged that the so-called humorous man's name was permanently inked on his list after that night. Even decades later, when he recounted the event, there was no grin or laughter at the recollection. Bill never condoned the intentional attempt to use the prankster as a punchline, even if the crowd loved him. While some of the names on Bill Anderson's list were the result of backstage intrigues or ego conflicts, one stood out for a completely different reason. It was a friendship that ended so badly that Bill would always be scarred. This was no ordinary Opry acquaintance or fellow entertainer with whom he occasionally shared the stage. Bill had thought of this person as a brother. Back in the lean years, they had traveled the country together, sharing small motel rooms, dividing gas money, and trading a single guitar while working on tunes late into the night. Together, they had survived roadside snowstorms, little performances in dance halls that were only partially occupied, and the excitement of their first large-scale performance at the Opry. What followed was all the more tragic because of that background. Bill's acquaintance started to advance rapidly in the field as the years went by. His photo appeared on every poster, and his voice could be heard on the radio everywhere. However, stardom also came with a cost. Bill observed that there were fewer calls. Bigger opportunities took precedence over the songwriting sessions that used to be the high point of their weeks. Bill initially attributed it to the pressures of success, but rumors started to spread backstage. There were rumors circulating that his former companion had been claiming credit for tunes they had co-written in those motel rooms. When Bill learned that one of their first collaborations, something they had put their all into, had been re-recorded and released without mentioning his name, the shock turned to rage. The last break occurred at a well-known Opry anniversary performance. In the hopes that they might joke about the past, Bill had been thrilled to meet his friend once more. However, when a reporter inquired about their early collaboration, the man smirked and dismissed it as a matter of the early days, as though it were nothing. Bill felt something snap inside of him as he stood there grinning for the cameras. It wasn't only a professional treachery. It was so intimate. The man he had previously trusted with both his friendship and his career was added to his list of permanent buddies that night. For the purpose of destroying their former friendship, not for trivial competitiveness. Not every name on Bill Anderson's list was the result of a profoundly personal betrayal or years of history. One resulted from a single, unmistakable fact that Bill was unable to deny. On the Grand Ole Opry stage, there were certain people who just didn't belong. During the Opry's efforts to update its image and appeal to a younger audience, this particular performer was brought in as a crossover act. It made sense on paper. They were well known, topping charts in multiple genres and selling out arenas. However, Bill felt that their treatment of the Opry was a betrayal of all that it stood for. It was immediately apparent that they viewed the Opry as merely another stop on their publicity tour rather than as a hallowed place. They occasionally skipped rehearsals completely or arrived late. Tradition had no meaning. There was no respect for the MC who introduced them, no handshake with the house band, and no recognition of the luminaries who had cleared the path. One night, Bill remembered, the artist sailed in with an entourage twice as large as the Opry crew on duty, arriving about 40 minutes late. This outsider was reading through their phone and hardly looking up when someone talked to them, while other artists waited anxiously backstage, practicing their lines or polishing their guitars. They trimmed their concert short by 2 songs when they eventually took the stage, dismissively waving to the crowd as though their presence was a favor. Bill's stomach churned as he stood in the wings. The Opry was more than just a location. It was a living, breathing representation of the history of country music. Numerous artists' hopes were weighed down by each brick and plank of that stage. And here was someone who was in and out of it carelessly, treating it like a casual gig. You have to respect country music, but you don't have to love it to be here, Bill subsequently stated. Respect wasn't a word that this artist used. And that was sufficient to guarantee their spot on his list. For Bill, it was more than simply the music. It was about paying respect to the Opry's essential essence. This stranger had never even attempted to comprehend it. No amount of experience could have prepared Bill Anderson for the kind of public humiliation he suffered one night beneath the glaring stage lights, even though he had been playing at the Grand Ole Opry for decades. It was intended to be a unique show. Bill had been granted a prominent position to perform a heartfelt ballad he had penned years before, smack in the middle of the evening broadcast. The sort of song that left the audience in a state of silent contemplation, rather than only providing amusement. Everything went well with the introduction. Bill's voice filled the room with that comforting, velvety silence as the opening notes rang out. And then, suddenly, it occurred. Another well-known, raucous, and notoriously attention-seeking Opry artist strode onto the stage in the middle of a song. The audience initially chuckled, thinking it was a prearranged comedy routine, but Bill realized right once that this wasn't part of the script. Claiming that it was actually their turn to perform, the invader strode straight up to the microphone and informed the audience that there had been a mix-up in the set list. The band gazed back and forth between the two of them in shock, and Bill froze, dumbfounded, guitar still in hand. Uncomfortably, the laughter faded into awkward silence, and then the band, obviously under pressure, started to follow the example of the other performers into a completely new tune. Bill moved aside, remaining on stage but no longer participating in the act. He was now merely a spectator during his own time slot. It was an odd, albeit perplexing, moment that the crowd might laugh about later. Bill, however, saw it as a deliberate and vicious act of disrespect. Later, backstage, he found out it hadn't been an error. The other performer chose to make a statement since they were upset about being positioned later in the lineup. They laughed it off as though they had done the crowd a favor rather than offering an apology or admitting the harm they had caused. Bill never openly challenged them. The insult had been etched in stone in his head, yet it wasn't his way. That type of on-stage thievery was unacceptable to a man who adhered to the unwritten rule of respect amongst artists. That name became one of the others on his list after that night. A constant reminder that ego can ruin everything, even in a location where tradition and music are the foundation. Perhaps the most startling name on Bill Anderson's list was the last one. It was because it belonged to one of the most admired people in the history of country music, not because it was the result of a small argument or one particularly memorable insult. This artist was untouchable in the eyes of the audience. The type of entertainer whose name was mentioned in the same sentence as the Opry itself with awe. However, they symbolized to Bill the worst that celebrity could do to a person. The haughtiness was evident from the moment he first saw them. It wasn't a person who had earned their position's peaceful assurance. It was the savage, contemptuous type that appeared to enjoy making people feel insignificant. Bill remembered how they would openly disparage younger singers in backstage banter, making fun of their fashion sense, songs, and even attire. They saw the Opry as more of a kingdom than a family, and they were without a doubt its ruler. Bill heard this performer reject entire generations of country music artists as imitators who had no place on the stage they had constructed. The contempt was overt. It was a purposeful performance in and of itself, frequently given in close proximity to the people they were trying to reach. Even Bill was not exempt. His gentle whispering manner was constantly mocked by the folklore, who called it half-singing and implied that it had no place in a place that was founded on authentic rural voices. Direct confrontations did not occur. Everyone who worked the Opry stage could see how frigid they were to each other, even though Bill had no interest in insults. The legend's actions remained constant over the years. It got worse, if anything. They skipped rehearsals, declined cooperation, and made increasingly absurd demands with each appearance. Despite this, they were impenetrable due to their legendary status. It was accepted by management. The fans never saw the side of other musicians that Bill knew so well because they kept their heads down. Whilst requested if there has been ever a threat for reconciliation, Bill failed to hesitate. No longer everybody deserves a second chance, he stated honestly. It wasn't bitterness in his voice, just a calm fact. In his mind, a few wounds did not heal. And a few personalities had been so entrenched of their own ego that no apology, if it ever got here, might suggest a component. This unapologetic legend, celebrated via hundreds of thousands, might continually remain at the very pinnacle of his listing. Whilst the interview first started, no person predicted Invoice Anderson to move where he went. For a man who had built his complete career on international relations, kindness, and the capacity to upward push above struggle, revealing the names of 8 fellow Grand Antico Perry performers he had disliked. Some intensely seemed completely out of person. However, Invoice explained it with the equal calm, deliberate voice that had carried him through hundreds of performances. You get to a sure age, he stated, and you stop disturbing about what human beings assume. You begin thinking about what is true. For Invoice, the Opry wasn't just a level. It became a domestic. And prefer any domestic, it had its proportion of heat, love, and laughter. But it additionally had its cracks within the walls, its hidden arguments, its unspoken resentments. For decades, he had selected to awareness on the best, to keep his tales mild, his interviews excellent. However, with maximum of his career at the back of him, he felt an responsibility now not to settle rankings, but to tell the complete story of what lifestyles become actually like behind the scenes. He pressured that this wasn't approximately gossip or revenge. These weren't just little disagreements, Invoice stated. These were moments that formed my time here. Moments that modified how I noticed human beings. Moments that made me more potent in methods I did not recognize back then. In his eyes, sharing the reality became a manner of honoring the Opry, not tearing it down. He desired humans to remember the fact that the legends they noticed smiling collectively on stage had been nevertheless people able to jealousy, pettiness, and cruelty. And he was hoping younger artists listening could eliminate a lesson. Expertise may get you through the door. However, person determines how long you remaining. Invoice also admitted there was a form of peace in the end speaking the phrases out loud. For years, the one's reminiscences had lived only in his thoughts, replaying whenever he crossed paths with one of these 8 names, or every time a Well That Means fan told him how much they should have cherished running together. Now, with the one's stories within the open, there has been no extra pretending. I'm not happy with hating anyone, he stated quietly. But I'm happy with status up for what I accept as true with is right. Appreciate topics. The Opry matters. And on occasion you have to call matters what they may be. The response in Nashville became immediately. Some lovers have been stunned. Some defended the names on his listing and others thanked him for his honesty. But Invoice failed to measure the success of his confession in applause or outrage. He measured it in the freedom he felt walking off that interview level, knowing that at final the total fact of his Opry journey had been told. As he appeared again on the A Long Time of track, the friendships that lasted, and the rivalries that failed to, Invoice carried no regrets. Approximately speaking out, I've made my peace with maximum matters in existence, he stated with a faint smile. But no longer with those 8 names. And that is all right. Some truths are higher left sharp. They remind you of where you've been and who you simply are. And with that, the man recognized for whispering ended his story with an announcement that turned into whatever, however quiet. An unvarnished glimpse into the coronary heart of the Opry from someone who had seen it.